Welcome back. We are about to start on the thigh armor. So what we're going to do first is, of course, size up our thighs. We want to make sure you have the proper sides first. So we're just going to start with the left thigh. So I'm looking for a left inner and a left outer. And if you can't quite tell, in general, or with most makes of armor, the inner piece of the armor, the part that goes on the inside of your thigh, it's going to have a deeper cut to it. Where it's going to leave room for your crotch, right? And then the outer thigh is generally cut a lot higher. Okay, so there's not as much of a deep cut. So there's going to be two of these. There's going to be one for a left and a right, and there's going to be two of these, one for a left and a right. So all you need to do is match up the correct ones, even if they're not labeled, and you should know what left and right are. So I'm about to go and trim some of this excess material off because we're going to be using a 20 millimeter or 20-ish cover strip to join the halves, much like the arms sort of generally used like 15 to 17 or 18 millimeters. The fronts of the thighs are thought to be around 20 millimeters, and then the backs are about 25. So a lot of people used to use 20 in the back, but nowadays with the back of the shin, with that sort of being determined that it's more around 25 millimeters, people sort of like to see the same consistent width going up the back of the leg. So because we've already done an initial test fitting, I know that I'm going to be able to trim more of this off. If you're a bigger trooper and you actually need more width to glue on, well, don't go crazy and cut a bunch of this off and only leave 10 millimeters on one side and the other side. And then glue them, really, really, really far apart. You might be better if you had it so that, say, you had 15 on each side and then join them together. So it's a little bit of kind of math that you need to do to kind of figure out what fits your particular body. We sort of talk about what the ideal sizes are, which is, 20 millimeters on the front, which is 10 millimeters remaining on each side of this ridge. And that's what I'm going to do for this particular build, but you need to be very careful with sizing the armor up first. So it's a lot of sort of taping to see what fits, and then also seeing what kind of gap is left behind. If you're, attempting to do a 20 millimeter on the front, and then when you wrap it around your leg, there's this gigantic gap. Well, maybe what you want to do is balance it out, spread the front of it apart a little bit more, and use a slightly wider cover strip, and then that way that'll sort of reduce the gap in the back. So it's very hard for me to determine what is the perfect size for each person, because everyone's a different size. So for this particular build, I'm going to be doing it with a 20 millimeter cover strip, 10 millimeters on each side, but for you, that's going to have to be something that you measure. And I'll probably edit the video and show a little bit sort of how the sizing works. And for right now, I'm going to start marking this off, measuring it, and trimming it. So here I'm using a ruler to measure 11 millimeters in from the ridge. Normally you'd leave about 10 millimeters, but because the thigh is a little bit bigger, I'm going with 11. So 11 plus 11 on each, the inner and the outer thigh will give me about 21, 22 cover strip width, which is sort of in proportion for this particular armor. So just doing the same thing I did before, making some marks, using some spring clips to hold a piece of plastic in place, and then tracing the line and then trimming them off with a pair of Lexan scissors, and then I'm just sanding off any sort of high spots or bumps and then putting it back together. Got the thighs trimmed out, we can tape them together and make sure that they are going to fit. So we're going to tape the halves together just like we normally would for any of the other limbs, and then this will give us a better idea of how the back should fit, and then we're going to make some marks on the back of the thighs that will indicate where they will need to be trimmed. So I'm just applying a bit of glue masking tape to the outside of the thigh. You can put some on the inside if you want to, but the important part is more that they are taped together and not squirming around. So, and you want to get them fairly butted together. You don't want to have any gap in between, so make sure that they're pretty solid. You can see that's pretty good there. Right? And just a little simple trick, oops, sometimes I like to do is throw a little extra piece of tape right around the top, and then tape it on the back side as well too. And then if you have problems with it splitting open or something like that, sometimes I'll just throw a piece there like that, and then same thing on the lower half. Just kind of keeps things neat and tidy so that they're not flopping around on you all the time. Alright, so let's go do some test fitting. What's basically going to happen is you're going to want to figure out where the thigh needs to be trimmed along the back. Now the trick with that, or the issue with that sometimes, is back in the day when people were building FX armor or some of the older armors, the thighs were really straight. They were really parallel like that, and that's not really how the original thighs were shaped. Now this is of course depending on the end user's thigh. I mean, if you got bigger thighs, sort of top and bottom, that's going to have to be how you build them. But in a perfect world, you want the bottom to be narrower than the top. So what we need to figure out is where along this part it needs to be trimmed. And ideally what you want to do is trim it in such a way so that the cover strip that's going to get mounted on the back is not, askew at an angle. So you don't want it to be like this, for example. You want it to be centered. Pardon me while I try to do this with a couple hands. You kind of want to try to have it centered. So if it's a little wider at the top and it's narrow at the bottom, you want that strip to run down the center of this dimension and the center of this dimension. So again, you don't want it skewed like this or like this. And so what you're going to do is when you size it on the back of the thigh, let's just pretend that this is the size of the wearer. I'm just going to clamp it here to make things a little bit easier. So let's pretend that this is the actual size that it needs to be. What you want to do is figure out where the middle of this dimension is. And most of the time it's going to be splitting the difference between these two corners. So say for example, this is the perfect fit. You're going to want to look down the thigh and try to eyeball it so that where you're going to cut is centered on this thigh. So, is it over here? Is it over here? And I'm just looking at it and it's probably a little bit more like, right about there. It's almost about halfway. So what you want to do is make a mark on the outside, or sorry, the inside of the thigh, and you want to make a mark on the outside of the thigh, right? So imagine you're going to take a laser and you're going to cut right down that. You're going to throw this part out, and you're going to throw this part out right here, and discard that, and then you're going to throw this part out on the inside. Okay, you want to do the same on the back. When we get down to the back, say for example that is where the fit is perfect on the wearer. If this is the middle point, right down the whole left and right side of the thigh, that's where you're going to make your mark. And then what we're going to do is just very simply take our straight edge piece of plastic and draw a straight line along those two marks on the inside and on the outer, and then trim those out so that when they butt back together, they're the exact size that they need to be. And of course you want to tape them together and slide the thigh back onto the wearer to make sure that that's actually the case. But that's how you size up thighs. Here we are. We're going to start sizing up some thighs. So we had already started to trim the thighs down. We've left about 10 or 11 millimeters on each side of the thighs, and then we've taped them together, and now we've got the back taped together and the whole thing is taped together, so you can kind of see how it fits in terms of proportions and in relation to the cod and the abdomen. You want the thigh to be pulled up pretty much as high as it'll go. Right now it's quite long and it's touching here, but before we make any kind of modifications to the length of the thigh, it's best to assemble it first, at least with the front cover strip and the back cover strip, and then if you need to do any kind of trimming and whatnot, do it at that point. But you can see the thigh fits pretty good. You want that sort of tapered shape. You don't want it to be straight up and down, so you can see the thigh is wider at the top and it's fairly close fitting. There's probably only about a ½ inch of space on or a quarter of an inch on each side. A common mistake when people assemble thighs is they make the thigh way too big at the knee, and it actually just moves around way too much. So this is a really good fit right now. So We're going to take a look at the back side of the thigh. So ironically, when I sort of demonstrated how to size the rear of the thigh, it actually ended up being almost the exact size that fits. So just like we had described, where there's the overlap, we want to find that middle mark and basically kind of split the difference between the left and the right side, and that's where we're going to make the vertical cut. So you can see that it's overlapped here. On the bottom, it's probably overlapped about an inch, and on the upper part, it's overlapped about 3/4 of an inch. So there's plenty of room there to cut it. The convenience is that this armor is made for bigger troopers. So being a bigger model, there's enough plastic here to play with, and there's no need to shim it any wider. If you find that your thigh armor is actually too small, you will need to open it up and insert like a larger shim in the back. And we might talk about that in a separate construction video. But right now, everything's looking pretty good. And this is probably the strangest video I've ever made.
So with the front of the thigh assembled, we're just using our marks that we made in the back of the thigh, and using a straight edge, and just using some spring clips to keep the plastic strip straight, and then trimming the backs out, and just making sure that there's a nice clean cut on both halves. And then we're going to be taping it up and doing the final assembly for the back. So just doing a little test fit here, making sure the lines are still straight. And then what I'm doing is I'm sanding down the outer surface of each side of the thigh. And what I'm doing is just making some pencil marks. Again, kind of the 10, 11, or actually a little bit wider this time. It's about 12 millimeters, because we're using a 25 millimeter cover strip in the back. So the backs of the shins or calves use a 25 millimeter cover strip. Same with the back of the thighs. We're using 25. So I'm measuring about 12 millimeters on both sides, and then sanding the outer surfaces down. So I'm just taping up the thighs on the inside. A little trick that I sometimes do is I'll use a piece of tape across the bottom like that, just to kind of pull the tension a little bit closer together. And here I'm cutting my 25 millimeter cover strip, and sort of while the plastic was out, I was cutting the 25 millimeter cover strip for the front of the thigh as well too. So just trying to be efficient. And of course you can cut up all the cover strips, if you know that that's what's going to fit for your particular build. But just for demonstration purposes, I'm just doing the front and back. And again, I'm just cutting those corners, taking off about 2 millimeters, cutting the corners about 45 degrees. Sanding back side of the cover strip, and then applying 2 fairly generous beads of E6000. I go a little bit more generous because there's a little bit more surface area to cover on these 25 millimeter cover strips. And then now I'm applying some E6000 to the outer thighs as well too, or outer thigh and inner thigh. So just making sure I've got good coverage. So it's good that the pencil lines are there as a guide, trying to make sure that the glue doesn't get too close to those edges. Leaving about an eighth of an inch or so of the glue away from the edge so it doesn't ooze out too much. And just applying some masking tape to the cover strips so that I can conveniently center things up, making sure that the cover strips are centered. And something that I'm doing is on that lower part of the thighs, I'm using a couple pieces of scrap plastic just to shim the clamp a little bit higher so that it's got something to grab onto. Sometimes I find, depending on the clamp you're using, if you don't do that, the clamp's clamping down on the lower thigh ridge and not actually, compressing the seam together. So just like the other construction videos, using kind of an assortment of magnets and clamps to put it together. Again, be really, really careful with those rare earth magnets. So now that the back's assembled, I'm peeling all of the assembly tape off the front of the thigh. So I'm still leaving the tape on the inside, just peeled the tape off the outside. I probably could have sanded the outer ridges, before I assembled them, but I forgot to or didn't get around to it, but that's okay. I can just do it right now. And so since we cut up our front cover strip in terms of width, we just now need to cut it to length. We're going to cut those little corners off and do a little bit of sanding, take the sharp edges down, and then sand the bottom of the cover strip and prepare it for gluing. And then same as before, I'm applying some E6000. The beads are a little bit closer together this time, and just spreading that out, making sure it's smooth, and lining that tack up a little bit. And then I'm doing the outside of the thigh. And again, make sure that the clamps kind of have the extension. If you're using bar clamps, that the extension of the bar clamps is going outside, beyond the thigh. I know it's a little bit awkward. If depending on the size of your thigh, at the top you might be able to have one of the clamps facing inward, depending on the size of the clamp that you're using and the size of the thigh. But just sort of good practice. I put them on the outside to prevent them from the thigh from kind of rolling around or anything like that. And again, important, starting from one side of the thigh, working your way up. Don't clamp both ends and put the magnets in between, because you might not get a good seal or a good contact on the way down. I noticed that there's a bit of room so for a spring clamp, so I decided to shift the magnets down a little bit and make some room. And here are something I just wanted to demonstrate was using some popsicle sticks taped together as a shim, and putting them on the inside of the thigh, again, so that the clamps have like a really solid surface to clamp onto, and so they're not sitting above the ridge, if that makes sense. And here, after I think it's been about 18 hours, and so I'm peeling all of the tape and the magnets off. There's a little bit of a gap. The thighs kind of creeped open just a little bit on the bottom there, but it's not a big deal. We'll fix that up, and it won't really be noticeable. But it sort of moved apart about the 1/16 of an inch, and but that's okay. We'll be able to fix that up. So just peeling all the glue and all the tape away, using a little bit of a popsicle stick to rub off any glue boogers that might be remaining. But that's about it. It's pretty straightforward. Just make sure you take your time to test fit and measure the thighs properly before you assemble them, and they'll turn out great. So good luck.